There are hundreds, if not thousands, of videos about the North End in Boston, about the Rose Kennedy connection, organized crime, smugglers using tunnels under the Old North Church during Prohibition, and the donation of wooden angels to the church by a pirate, of Tony DeMarco, the world welterweight champion who was born here in 1932, of the Brinks robbery building, which is now a parking garage, and many, many more historic moments and sites. This video is about my return to the North End and my thoughts as I walk around the streets and in the steps of my father's side of the family as they first came to America and moved into the North End. My grandfather, Pasquale Amorelli, came to America on the Regina d'Italia in 1914, prior to Italy and America entering the First World War. My grandmother, Divina Vera Stefano, her parents, brother, and sister came over on the U.S. America in 1920. You have to stop and think, how bad were things back in southern Italy that some 22,000 just in the North End alone were willing to actually get on these ships that today we wouldn't even want to put our mail on. In order of appearance, Angelina came first, then my father, Francesco, then Antoinette, and finally Vito. John Constantino would join the family later. According to the 1930 census, my grandmother and children moved here on Charter Street. Charter Street is right behind the Copp's Hill Cemetery, which is a very famous cemetery as the first and primary burial ground for Boston's early black population, as well as the burial sites of numerous participants in the 1773 Boston Tea Party. Behind the cemetery is now a park, which used to have buildings which were torn down for the park. I wonder when I go up there that I can see across the Charles and I can see the Constitution and Bunker Hill. I gotta wonder what they used to see. Since the Great Molasses Flood happened in 1919 and my family arrived in 1920, I'm sure that they still got to see some of the devastation and experience some of that sickening sweet smell that must have permeated the air for years. Close to where they lived, Charter Street crosses Salem Street, which is where the Old North Church is. Behind the church, bordering Hanover, this is what I see when I walk here. But this is what they saw. These two rows of tenements were torn down in the 30s to make way for the Paul Revere Park, which is also a big tourist attraction. I have often wondered about the name of this street, Henchmen. Like every other group of immigrants, the Italians faced discrimination and fought for acceptance. This plaque commemorates one of the consequences of discrimination that my family, like so many others, had to overcome when they first arrived. St. Leonard's was the first specifically Italian-built Catholic church in Boston, and who knows, maybe my Aunt Tony's first communion was here. When people visit the North End, they may miss some of the little things because you're paying more attention to the restaurants and the bakeries and the crowds. There are little neighborhoods inside the neighborhoods. You look down a narrow alleyway and you'll see an additional alleyway going behind the buildings. There are actually entire neighborhoods in them. I wonder if my family was even allowed to go down some of them. You see, when people moved here from Italy, Italy had just become a united country. Up until that time, it was made up of specific regions. People thought of themselves more by the regions that they came from, and Italians second. And when they came to America, they stayed in neighborhoods with people they were familiar with. same dialect, and in some cases, even the same neighbors that came over here with them. They all had their turf marked out, so you, or we, never really know how much crisscrossing was going on, at least in the earlier part of the century. As I walk these streets and know that my family struggled here to live and work and become accepted Americans that I cannot take for granted, that I can just walk into any restaurant for a quick bite or dinner, which is something they probably couldn't do. But as they walked these streets, they had no idea that they were working their way to becoming part of America's greatest generation. I often wonder if this is the school that my father skipped most of his classes. I'm sure my family attended these festivals, and I know my grandmother attended them even after she moved to the burbs. Although the North End is known internationally as Little Italy, you wouldn't know that from the names of the streets. And that's because the English came here, the Irish, Jewish, and then the Italians. But every now and then, you'll see an Italian name. There is also a family story that one of our cousins was the last family to live in the Paul Revere house prior to it becoming a museum. Also, that one of those cousins was the last baby born there. That kid went on to become the sexton of the Old North Church, provided guiding tours for the Queen of England and President Gerald Ford. Eventually, my grandmother and the crew moved out to the burbs. She bought a small convenience store attached to a house that sold beer and wine and groceries that had the reputation of having the coldest beer in town. She and John worked that store for the rest of their lives. I suppose their biggest claim to fame is that a young Aerosmith band used to stop here, but I won't get into what they might have tried to buy. You'll have to ask them. This was where their children, their spouses, and their grandchildren had some of the best times of their lives. The family at Nani's house are way too many to mention here, but you know who you are. The kids sat at the kids' table. You knew you were an adult when you got to sit at the adults' table. However, we didn't realize it at the time, but becoming an adult was really a trap. Nani was the unchallenged matriarch of the family. Her authority was unquestioned and most of all respected, and she had the wooden spoons to back it up. When she yelled Vera or Frank or Tony or Vito, a bunch of us had to turn around, both kids and adults. We would all turn wondering who it was she was referring to. Everything was handmade, no store-bought raviolis at Nani's. I watch the sunsets and the views from the North End, and I always think back to the times when my father's side of the family lived here. That their American story started here. I think of those I grew up with, those no longer with us, the many new members of our family, many of whom I've never met. But I never forget that for my family, these streets were their gateway to America.